You know, Mr. Muramatsu is possibly the founding father of Japanese interpreting, and has been working and educating in that area for many, many years, with, of course, the Simul group in Tokyo. We often see Mr. Muramatsu here in August with the Simul Academy group, but on this occasion he's on a lecture tour in Australia. So may I welcome you to the university and to our conference, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rick Sensei. Nice to see you again, some familiar faces and new friends. Good day. I bring greetings from Japan. Many Japanese are fond of this country, partly in some measure because of my influence. This morning I met two young Japanese women who, after all, emigrated to this country after they heard my lecture about Australia. So I'm here thanks to the sponsorship by the Australia-Japan Foundation of the Commonwealth Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I'm happily contributing my time. My last visit to Australia was in May to Canberra on the occasion of the 11th Australia-Japan Ministerial Conference, where I led a team of 3 Japanese-English simultaneous interpreters. And we have many bilateral Japanese such country, or even some regional conferences of business people. And Japan-Australia Business Cooperation Committee meetings are the oldest of all the bilateral meetings between Japan and other countries. It goes back some almost 30 years, 28 or 29. Next meeting will take place in Nagoya in October. Next week there will be, as you know, a summit meeting in London of the heads of state and government of the industrialized nations, employing 5 languages spoken by the 7 participating nations: the Japanese, English, French, German, and Italian. And simultaneous interpretation is, as you know, in the fashion of relay interpreting by way of English. As far as the Japanese is concerned, the Japanese Prime Minister speaks, is interpreted simultaneously into English by one of our junior colleagues, which English is picked up by our European colleagues into their respective languages, German, French, and Italian. And conversely, when the Italian Prime Minister speaks in Italian, it is interpreted into English, which English we render into Japanese. For the summit meetings and the most demanding conferences of that type, delay interpretation has almost always worked beautifully. We have never had problems or complaints because people do take extra care in selecting the most experienced interpreting from all the language combinations. And we are most careful in being articulate in our rendition from Japanese into English, more careful than normally we are, because slightest ambiguity becomes, of course, amplified. But I'm not going to London. Instead, I'm happily here, and next week on the west coast of the United States, giving 2 lectures and chairing one small Japanese Western United States Business People's Conference. I'm sort of out of market as an interpreter, and I seem to be more demand as a teacher and lecturer. That all I really enjoy, because I believe in what the economists call the comparative advantage. I still think I can interpret, but I like to interpret for former heads of state and government rather than incumbents, because it's less rigorous and less demanding and more enjoyable. And there are a lot of young people whom I had helped partly to be what they are, and they find summit assignments the most challenging and the most glamorous. I'm interested in a few specific topics that might be of some marginal interest to you, interpreting jokes or humor. Supplementing few words as sort of technical footnotes to make sure that the audience understand what the speaker is talking about. How to deal with some of the non-native English speakers' English. And then the non-verbal aspects of simultaneous interpreting. What the interpreter has to read in the way of reading the expressions and gestures of the speakers. How to deal with proverbs and puns, and very important subject in the case of social consecutive interpreting over lunches and dinners where the interpreters are not served food, or how to deal with that situation. And when you are seated and given the same food, same meal as the dignitaries, how to enjoy the best of the cuisine while interpreting and so on. How to work, in the case of someone who has been doing this for 41 years like me, how to work with a very much younger colleague who has a stage fright, all the more because of the presence of her a very elderly senior colleague or mentor or teacher, me. How to very, very subtly comfort her, make it easy for her, and when she runs out of breath or gets too tired or cannot follow the meaning, how to most gently and unobtrusively take over the microphone, how to give a gesture indicating my willingness to take over if she wants to be taken over, and doing this with minimum of noise. And then the part I really enjoy doing is to do it in such almost mimicking her rendition into Japanese or English, so that audience will not really notice. Well, it's a man's voice versus a female voice, but I do it in a way that you see, people will not say, that young interpreter couldn't go anymore, and her boss has taken over. I don't want to give that impression. So I begin my part rather clumsily, somewhat awkwardly, and then gradually bring it up to my level, and this way damage to her is minimal. First, my most favorite aspect. I don't think I'll have enough time, but I'll be happy to answer your questions on any of these topics that might interest you. Jokes. Too many speakers tell jokes just to be funny, and test the interpreters. That is not funny to us. One very distinguished American intellectual, who shall remain nameless, is actually a very nice man, very much of a gentleman, whom I have known professionally for the last few years. I respect him, I like him, and he likes me because I laugh at his jokes, and I can translate his jokes well. One day before delivering his major address in English, without any prepared notes, and he said, "Muramatsu, I'm going to tell a joke and see if we can translate." So, we're friends, sort of. I said, with a mock pompous fashion, I said, "Sir, if you mean to entertain your audience, I'll do my darndest to make them laugh with you. But if you tell a joke to be just too mean to me, I might make them laugh when you don't want to be laughed at." And he said, "All right, I get the message." And he behaved in exemplary fashion. A couple of occasions where I supplemented few words to make sure the audience get what the speaker is trying to convey. When the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, spoke at the Japanese Diet or Parliament about 5 years ago, I was doing the consecutive interpretation. The occasion was being broadcast by television nationwide, so it was not just the members of the Diet and the stuffed audience up in the gallery. They like to select the audience because of the security. At the time of President Reagan, they were very cautious, and they, in fact, brought in, rented, or hired wireless receivers they had to bolt down each receiver to the arm of the chair so that no prankster or terrorist would throw a receiver at the guest. There was no such worry about the Prince Charles. In the middle of his speech, he was quite humorous. Not outright funny, but he has subtle English sense of humor, which came through pretty well. And I think I can take a little credit when he mentioned the fact that the then emperor, the late emperor's grandson, Prince Naruhito, who is now, of course, the crown prince, studied at Oxford. He said the British people were very pleased when the emperor's grandson chose Oxford for his further education. However, and that, however, is of course slightly different tone, indicating that a funny story is coming. And I was all prepared for that. However, if my view had been asked for, I would have recommended Cambridge. Of course, this is a good-natured joke. No Japanese should take it seriously. But just in case some of the Diet members and Japanese members, have a tendency to fall asleep or meditate while listening and then fall asleep in reality. Just in case they may not associate these two universities as two friendly but rival institutions. In rendering this into Japanese, もし私の意見が, and then of course I changed my tone in a slightly informal fashion, alerting the audience that this is not a serious story. And I would have recommended, I say, 私は instead of saying ケンブリッジをお勧めしたでしょう, I added two words, 私の母校, my alma mater. 私の母校、ケンブリッジをお勧めしたでしょう. And everybody laughed. They brought the house down. It was a spontaneous burst of laughter, which of course was broadcast in Britain, and I'm sure a lot of British people concluded that after all, those Japanese do understand humor. President Reagan was in Japan about a year ago and was a dinner speaker at a very expensive function, something like $1,000 plate dinner. And, he tells jokes usually quite well. And noticing the gadgets, he said, well, this reminds me that then I could almost anticipate the joke he was going to tell. When I was governor of California, I was asked by the then president, Mr. Nixon, to go to Mexico to attend an international conference representing the United States. And when I began my speech, I was rather annoyed that nobody applauded when I finished. And I was all the more annoyed and upset when the next guy stood up and began talking, and at the end of every sentence people was applauding. So just not to be outdone, when he stopped at one place, I got up and applauded harder and longer than anyone else. When the American ambassador sitting next to me said, Governor, if I were you, I wouldn't do it. He's translating his speech into Spanish, of course. However, this was simultaneous. Reagan did not say he's interpreting. He says typically translating. He's translating your speech into Spanish. He didn't say into Spanish. He's been telling that joke too often. And he assumes everybody understands that in Mexico the language is Spanish. Not necessarily is this understood in Japan readily. So I added, あの人は今、あなたのスピーチをスペイン語に通訳してるんですよ。into Spanish was my addition, which made sure that the audience laughed. And President Reagan was visibly pleased. Non-native speakers English. Once I interviewed for Yasser Arafat in Tokyo. It was a semi-open meeting. There were press people. The event was reported, so I have no qualms about repeating this anecdote. He was speaking rather labored English, let's put it this way. I'm sure his French is far better. But his English had not only French accent, but of course heavy Arabic accent. And he was trying to invite the Japanese businesses to come and invest and build plants, basically build factories in his part of the Middle East. what he considered his part. And he said, the Japanese managers are welcome, Japanese engineers are welcome, we like Japanese technology. Now everybody says that. But then everybody adds, we have manpower or labor force. In other words, unskilled labor. Every country has. Many of these countries who want Japanese investment. But he went on to say, and Japanese workers, the Japanese workers are free to travel in Palestine. Free to travel. We're not talking about tourism. So I asked, this was consecutive. Excuse me, sir, did you mean free to work? He said, yes, 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 free to work. Thank you, Mr. Interpreter. He was thinking obviously about travailler, and then automatically translated into English word travel. And this I have noticed happens from time to time. Is that called Gallicism? The influence of the French over this English that one person speaks. We necessarily must get used to it. Non-verbal aspect. Again, President Reagan in one summit meeting in Tokyo. I served 10 summit meetings. At that time, that was a sort of a record. I should have registered myself with the Guinness Book. But later, Mrs. Thatcher attended her 11th summit. It's hard to beat that lady. In one meeting in Tokyo, where the late Prime Minister, Mr. Ohira, my favorite, because he was a learned gentleman, a scholar, he was chairing the meeting. But like most Japanese dignitaries, or particularly who have to chair a meeting, he was looking at notes, his scenario all the time, what is the next agenda. He was consulting with his foreign minister and the finance minister all the time. He wasn't looking at these people. But looking at the people who are speaking, of course, is very important, as we all know. President Reagan was talking about some issue. Again, I'm not repeating what the issue was. In fact, I don't remember it. Many people think that I remember all these state secrets. I might say, no, I cannot repeat it. We have professional ethics, but it's fun to keep these people guessing that I know everything when I really don't remember any of the darn things, because these things don't interest me. But the little non-verbal gestures do interest me tremendously. Mr. Reagan's point was not being bought at all by everybody else, possibly with the exception of Britain. He was trying to solicit Mrs. Thatcher's sympathetic reaction when he said, and I could see him very well, he said, well, I know it's difficult to convince all of you, but I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. And when he said that, he was looking at Mrs. Thatcher, right in her eye. And he said, I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. And if you interpret it, Anata wa, Mr. Ohira, you will know who he was talking to, who he meant. So I changed it to, Thatcher-san, Anata wa, wakari kudasaru deshou kedo. At which point, hearing the word Thatcher-san, Mr. Ohira lifted his head and immediately grasped the situation. He smiled, yes, and the meeting went on quite well. And one American idiosyncrasy, I think Americans do this more than anyone else I have noticed. When they quote, and by the way, when the Japanese speakers quote from other people, they don't change the tone of voice mostly because they are reading. And they don't say quote unquote. And when the thing finally comes to the end, you find out that he's been quoting someone else all the time. What do we do? And suddenly, now I end the quote, and as an interpreter I do this emphatically enough so that my audience will think, oh, that part has been quotation. Maybe I missed the first part. Blame is on these people, not on the interpreter. Pass the buck. The Americans very often use these hand gestures for double quote. You know this. Instead of saying quote unquote, or now I quote, or the so-called. When the Americans do this, it indicates that words are not his, and the belief or impression is not his. It's very important for us to be watching that gesture and say, iwayuru, or so-called, and some such equivalents. Too many young interpreters are busy taking notes, which I think is a mistake, or look at the notes written by her colleague. They have this teamwork. They do it excessively. I encourage more independence, looking at the notes of the colleague only when you really need some help. And the colleague should write something only when she suspects that her colleague needs help. Otherwise, no bothering. Proverbs, puns generally, of course, are untranslatable, as we know, with a few delightful exceptions. In one finance minister's meeting almost 2 decades ago in Paris, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer was getting fed up in a sort of mock gesture of anger and disillusionment. He was picking up his briefcase and was getting up, and I'm going to take my flight back to London. Oh, he said, this reminds me of the story of 2 skeletons in the British Museum who have been there for ages. One skeleton said to the other, if I had any guts left, I'd get the heck out of here. Fortunately, this was over lunch, and I was sitting behind the then finance minister, who later became Prime Minister of Japan. And guts, fortunately, translates into Japanese, literally and figuratively in the same meaning. もし肝っ玉があったらば、肝っ玉, guts or liver, in this case, nerve or presence of mind. Went beautifully, and my client was able to laugh almost simultaneously with his European counterparts. How to eat and interpret. When you are seated, fortunately, I like to be seated, because I think it's inhuman to be seated behind those people who are enjoying food. It doesn't matter how much we can consume. It doesn't matter if we cannot touch the food. It's a matter of gesture, looking decent. I teach young interpreters, and we also offer courses for our public servants, young diplomats, particularly protocol interpreting and social dinner occasions. I encourage them to concentrate on gourmet items, expensive plates that you can't afford normally. Don't bother with cheap stuff. They don't really serve fried potatoes or mashed potatoes, but if they do, don't bother with this, because potatoes usually you cannot swallow very easily. They tend to get stuck, they're hot. Don't bother with salad. Salad you have to chew, and they make a lot of noise. Concentrate on soft, tender, high protein, gourmet food, and you can be very selective. If a good piece of steak or roast beef is served, if it looks really good, look at the person who is speaking and anticipate the length of his utterance. If it's going to be a long speech or short intervention. If someone starts saying, well, it's a long story, but let me try to explain. You see, in Japan, something like it, cut the big chunk of steak and enjoy it. And if the person is a witty one, and you can see that she or he has a very short witty answer, make it a very small piece. And good beef piece of meat, you can always swallow with no problem with digestion. And because seriously, you need energy for the whole afternoon. And if everything else fails, toward the end of the meal, you can always pick up a lot of calories with the sweets. If everything else fails, if with your mouth full, the speaker suddenly stops, looks at you, prompting you to now translate. What you do, I tell my students, with your mouth full, give that person the nastiest look you can manage. He will usually say, oh, I'm sorry, I better let you eat. Now, I think this is perfectly legitimate. My final anecdote is an old one, but still valid. It's very, very pertinent to our profession. Some situation that we would like to avoid, actually. The story between Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. They were negotiating toward the end of the war in Europe about how to divide Japan after the war over a lot of vodka. Joseph Stalin was, of course, heavy drinker. Churchill didn't want to be outdone, and they were getting drunker and drunker and drunker, talking about lots of things and agreeing about lots of things, and yes, tomorrow morning we will sign the treaty or agreement. But when Churchill woke up next morning, he had a terrible hangover and headache. He said, darn it, just can't remember the single thing I agreed to last night. And over the breakfast said, Comrade Joseph, I can remember the single thing I agreed with you last night. What do I do? Stalin said, no, don't worry, I don't remember anything either. Besides, I just had that interpreter shut. Thank you.
Fortunately, interpreters don't get shot anymore, at least not in Japan or Australia. Thank you very much for those not only amusing but very pertinent remarks. Now, I'm sure you'll all have a lot of questions, so fire away. Who's going to be first?
If you want to hear more jokes, I'll be happy. But they have to be pertinent. Oh, interpretive jokes, yes. I try to collect them.
Sayuki.
Anyway, thank you very much for enjoyable answers. I just tried to remind you, I'm a language teacher. One of the important things that you teach is sort of keep good communication with your students and so lines over and whenever something happens, you notice. And since that you have very, very excellent communication with the person you are interpreting, of course you have sort of large experience and a lot of skills. However, do you have any tips, special tips that you can sort of improve your communication, or when you have a very short period, you have to translate, or any sort of suggestion for us to improve our sort of smoothness of communication?
I'm sure there are many ways. One way I try to do myself, to train myself and train younger people, is to be a good public speaker, a good storyteller yourself. If you can't remember a joke, if you cannot even deliver a joke decently well, how can you hope to interpret someone else's joke that you hear for the first time? My batting average has improved so much that I can anticipate the punchline almost all the way, time, almost. That's a great delight, and I enjoy doing it. Years ago, it used to be our peer, professional peer, not for me alone, but for most young interpreters, for missing the punchline. We just translate mechanically in staccato fashion, and suddenly all the English-speaking audience laughing, leaving the Japanese cold. You have missed the punchline. But I recommend my students to go and listen to rakugo, classical comic storytelling. I think it's a great art. And in fact, I can deliver a short rakugo or two. Not yet, no, I won't do it. But yes, to be a good storyteller yourself, have a lot of reservoir or anecdotes, be ready. And that's why knowledge of quotations is important. I have so many books. Now, the interpreter had better be looking at me when I do this gesture. Volumes and volumes of dictionaries, quotations of all sorts. Arming myself, to arm myself with the most often quoted quotes. As far as Japanese-English communication is concerned, the kind of meetings we serve, business, political, cultural, not so many quotes appear in purely technical, scientific, medical conferences, but normally in the order of Shakespeare's works, the Bible, Mother Goose, Nursery Rhymes. Then comes, I think, Alice in Wonderland, and then Savoy operas. Very interesting. Somehow British people seem to be fond of Mikado and the Pirates of Penzance and these things. And when they are quoted, they are absolutely, almost all cases, foreign to the Japanese, except few very famous Shakespearean and the biblical phrases. Mother Goose, virtually unknown to the middle-aged and older Japanese. But by constantly learning quotes, when somebody starts saying, which reminds me about what Winston Churchill said, my batting average is very high. So these are matters, I suppose, knowledge. Knowledge improves your skill. It's not just a matter of techniques that you learn.
I suspect that Daniel's next research might be predictable joke endings.
Let me join you.
Japanese interpreting. Stuart.
Mr. Lorenzo, I just wondered if you could answer this. In Australia, we have a bad reputation for using our language services overseas, and I wonder whether you have noticed any improvement or deterioration, or I wonder what you feel about
the way Australians use English?
Yeah, the attitude of senior government people, senior economists people who use the interpreters and generally language services. Do you think the situation is improving?
I think so. In fact, the very fact that the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade invited me and my colleagues all the way from Japan at some considerable expenses, I think is a great credit to their appreciation of the importance of that level of simultaneous interpreting. And we're happy to come here and work with several local colleagues because we can share experiences. And I think Australians have been quite good about it. Every 2, 3, 4 years when the meeting is held in Canberra, I seem to get invited. And however, on the other hand, the business people seem to be slower learners when it comes to this particular question. In one meeting in Japan, an Australian businessman, full of goodwill, was saying that he was talking in a manner slightly reproachful of fellow Australians. We Australians have tendency to use bad English, Australian idioms, colloquial expression that our Japanese friends don't understand. He was making the point that we should speak clean, neutral English, but the Australians always speak to the audience in Japan with our dialect, and this is what I call ocarism. Now there, he was using a very, very Australian word, ocarism. Fortunately, I was interpreting, so I quickly paraphrased that. I don't remember exactly how I did it, but I did it in 3 or 4 words. I never tried to interpret one noun into another noun. That, of course, is nonsense. You break it up, and sometimes you can condense the thought. But I was able to convey the unintended joke to the Japanese audience, and Japanese laughed together with Australians. I think, however, they're gradually appreciating this importance of language.
Actually, could I follow up on that question? Stuart's comment stems from the fact that a lot of people dealing with language in Australia feel that the Australian government and Australian business really don't understand how to use interpreters and languages properly.
Yep.
But could I ask, what's your experience in Japan about Japanese businesses' understanding of how to use interpreters and language properly?
Or they are probably most advanced in the world when it comes to that, because the Japanese are keenly aware of the difficulty of the translation or interpretation between the Japanese and English, and they appreciate our services very well. That is why we are constantly sent from Tokyo to all corners of the world. Our people have covered all the continents except Antarctica, and we of course come to Australia very often. Sorry if this is competition to some of you people here, but some competition is healthy. And in fact, in Japan, we always recommend bringing the European professionals, best in the profession, like Daniel, all the way from Europe. If you want, make sure that you have a successful conference. But very often, people try to recruit locally Japanese, German, French interpreter. No such animal exists really in Japan. But the Japanese generally, that's why for many of the important meetings overseas or delegations or missions, our Japanese clients insist on hiring us right from Tokyo, or now our second source of supply is in Osaka, but from Japan all the way to far places in the world. And however, the host organizations often don't understand why the Japanese have gone to that trouble. And very occasionally, the local host organizations insist that, oh, we can interpret. We have interpreted locally. And the Japanese said, all right, let them try once. And once is enough. Usually they go to the local ballet school. Really, they have gone to ballet school to recruit what they thought simultaneous interpreters.
I have a question about going back to the topic of the job. When I was interpreting, I used to get extremely offended having to translate text message jobs. And I think for a woman interpreter, I think it is a problem. I refused once and explained it to the job that I don't want to translate, not to interpret. But do you have any solutions to that?
I would not refuse it. No, when I'm interpreting, I'm one professional. Whether I'm a man or woman, I don't think it matters. And I don't think at least I don't, particularly when I'm in the booth, even if I blush, I won't show. I blush easily, actually. But sexist jokes, well, nowadays more and more jokes are sexist, and they are branded as taboos. But no, I think professional interpreters should basically repeat or interpret everything that is spoken. That is your job, and whether that joke amuses or offends the audience is the speaker's responsibility, not yours, no. And if the speaker says something vulgar, I would reproduce it, because if the vulgarness is intended for emphasis or whatever, then if the vulgarness is clearly intended, I would not edit it. I would not censor it. No, I don't believe in censoring it. And however, I can see your predicament, difficulty. My recommendation is you can affect a bit of embarrassment in the voice, in your tone. This way the audience will appreciate that the interpreter is a lady, she's embarrassed, but still she's doing her job. How's that?
Terry was first and then Yasko.
Well, if the vulgarity is not intended, if it's your impression and interpreter that in fact the speaker has no intention of offending the audience, what should you do? I
would soften it. Yes, I would soften it. If the verbal error or slip of the tongue or blooper is unintended, I would clean it up, and I've never been blamed or criticized for doing it. On the other hand, if the speaker means to speak very sincerely but is clumsy with words, yes, there are such people, I touch it up a little bit. I compare the interpreter job to that of a master chef. With his cutlery, a bit of salt and pepper, you enhance the flavor, the intended flavor. We hope that food will not poison the customers.
Of course, there have been, excuse me, a number of well-known international figures, particularly American negotiators, who were well known for their deliberate vulgarity, obviously for intended effects.
Yes.
Sorry, yes.
Suppose that you are doing consecutive interpretation, and often I find that the Japanese speaker tends to repeat a lot the same thing, maybe using other words as well, but often they repeat the same thing. In that case, do you...
Again, I will repeat it. Editing is not my job. Duplication or what's the word, verbosity or repetitiveness is not my responsibility. That's the way the person speaks, and I think the audience should understand this is the way this guy formulates his thought. Yes, I think that's the best correct understanding, good, correct communication.
So do you mean to say, for example, even though Japanese speakers repeat it, but
yes,
often we are so used to that way. In conversation, we always repeat.
Yes.
But in English, it sounds silly.
Not necessarily. I can quote numerous examples of the English speakers being repetitive. And in fact, when they're repetitive, my even consecutive interpretation is repetitive. The late Rajiv, not Rajiv, I did interpret for Rajiv Gandhi as my memorable assignment, but also Mujibur Rahman, the late Prime Minister of Bangladesh. I can count 4 international very famous political leaders, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Rajiv Gandhi, Mujibur Rahman, who were assassinated, not because I interpreted for them. But, Mujibur Rahman was in Japan for the press conference, official press conference, and he was telling us how Bengalese suffered from the British colonial torture, imperialism, and in a way typical to the people of that subcontinent, he was very eloquent, heavily accented Indian subcontinental English, and he said, the British arrested us, imprisoned us, tortured us, and murdered us. Now, and then he went on to how the nation was born, and he wouldn't give me a chance to interpret, and he would come back to the point, and all the British imprisoned us and tortured us again, and he did it 3 times. And finally I said, no, you know how to say it. Excuse me, sir, may I interpret? You never say, please don't give me a chance to interpret. That's impolite to me. I said, may I interpret? Then suddenly he remembers, oh yes, 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 please, I'd better let you. And people are amused, which is all right, breaks the ice. So when I repeat the Japanese rendition with a great force and almost with my hand gesture, I repeated his enthusiasm, his passion, because that was his commodity, which he wanted to convey, and the Japanese press should understand that he still feels that bitter about the British barbarism. And I repeated it 3 times, and perhaps my client understood that. And typically, people who speak up language without letting you interpret are the people who say, did I say all that? And you just smile politely and say, yes, sir, that is all. And the audience appreciates what you have done.
B.
Just a very short question, I cannot repeat that English. In the beginning, you were talking about nurturing these younger colleagues, and I noticed that you used the pronoun she repeatedly. I was just wondering, this younger colleague, always a female?
Not always, but one, I'm feminist. Feminist in the English sense of the word. In Japanese, feministo means a dirty old man, by the way. But I tell my Japanese audience, mixed audience, that as long as the Japanese men, you are feminist in the English sense, you are allowed to be a bit of a feministo, a bit of just. The fact I kept using she, the word she, was 95% of our colleagues are women. Are you interested in the reason? Okay. Yeah. Until recently, the market for brilliant, qualified, capable, educated women used to be kind of limited. And even when they want to they join after graduating university, some of the biggest corporations, often they end up serving tea and doing menial work, assisting men. So a lot of ambitious young women would rather not do that, but instead try interpreting career, even though they knew the chance of success is rather limited. So mostly women. On the other hand, the kind of well-qualified men that we like to see join our profession can actually easily join the foreign service and some of the blue-chip companies. In fact, that's the kind of people we like. So there's been overwhelming majority, a feminine majority. But now this situation is changing in Japan. Market is much more open to women, and women become not just computer programmers, but security analysts and more substantive career kind of work. So we are feeling the competition from these other callings. And on the other hand, we don't seem to be getting any particularly more men. And by the way, we are open to non-Japanese people. We have a few native English speakers or non-Japanese native Japanese speakers who have practiced or trained with us. A few have joined our profession. We'd like to welcome more.
Thank you, Mr. Muramatsu. Well, we do have one more paper before lunch, so it might be a good opportunity now to close this session and to thank Mr. Muramatsu very much for his very witty presentation. I must admit we've certainly learned a lot from him.
Thank you. And I gave Peter Davidson Sensei some of my reprints, and he may have to reproduce extra copies, but for those of you who liked my anecdotes, I'll be happy to send you more. I have reprints available.
Thank you.
Just give me your name and address. Thank you.
Perhaps I could just say the interest that Mr. on the desk if you'd like to help themselves. I've taken one or two steps so that we can make further copies for those who are lucky enough not to find them when they get them. We can organise copies for everything.
Yes, and if you need a copy, just put your name on the sheet there. Well, let's go.